Listen up. There's no more excuses.
We're empowering those who want the hustle by exposing the status quo.
The days of ordinary are over.
It's time to crush mediocrity and start discovering your greatest potential.
Welcome to the Hustle Nation. To the Hustle Nation.
To the Hustle Nation. To the Hustle Nation. To the Hustle.
Welcome back to Hustle Nation. Today, we've got a real treat for you. I've got my friend Richard Bliss. For those of you that are not familiar, Richard is author of the book Digital First Leadership, president of Bliss Point, a Silicon Valley consulting firm. Richard is a former software marketing executive and has presented in 22 different countries all around the U.S. and around the world. He's appeared on CNN, Good Morning America, and a laundry list of other big outlets. Some of his past writings can be found on Forbes.com, where he talks about a lot of different topics, including the NFL, cybersecurity, and board games. Like the most interesting man in the world, no doubt. Richard is a selling expert. He's a LinkedIn top voice, and he's host of the Digital First Leadership podcast, which I just listened to this morning. Richard, you go by a lot of names, but you're basically a LinkedIn Jedi. Welcome to the show.
Chris, thank you very much. What a pleasure. Thank you for that introduction as well. It sounds like I wrote it. So
maybe not.
Maybe, right.
Yeah. So, Richard, we recently discovered each other via LinkedIn, which is probably my favorite social media platform. That may surprise a few of you. But I had commented on a post of your friend, Richard Vanderblom, and you commented back and then sent me a DM. And I'm like, who is this LinkedIn Top Voices guy sending me a message? And you offered to send me a copy of your book, which I so graciously said yes. You put a phone number in your message. So I thought, when God opens a door, you should probably walk through it and have a conversation. And next thing you know, we had this great conversation. I'm like, you know what? This guy needs to be on our podcast. So we're so happy to have you today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And thanks for reaching out. It was a lot of fun. When you commented on Richard's comment, I pay attention. And when people have something to say, I think you should, especially because I tell people how to behave on LinkedIn. And when I saw your behavior, I was like, I need to kind of walk the walk if I'm going to talk the talk. So it was a chance for me to reach out and engage with you.
Yeah. I wasn't planning on going deep in LinkedIn, but one of the things I've always thought, and I've tried to approach that way, is I think it's important to stand for something. So if you have an opinion, so long as you're respectful, obviously, and courteous, that you should talk about that. And I think when you try to position yourself as a thought leader and post things that are thought provoking, and maybe even contrary at times, people will take notice and good things can happen, as have happened here.
Yep, absolutely. And so it's a pleasure. Thanks for reaching out on the podcast. It's always fun to have a conversation about a wide variety of topics.
Yeah. So let's jump in. You do a lot of different things. Tell us a little bit about your journey and how you got here.
Well, I was born, not that far back. Well, it depends on the journey and how I got here, because there's a lot there. So one is I'm a goal-oriented person. I write down goals. I track goals. I talk about goals. I talk about mindfulness and about manifestation. I have a journal right here next to me. I have my journals go back into the mid-'80s, having kept journals for more than 40 years. And the reason I bring that up is because oftentimes I will write down in those journals what I want to be and what do I want to accomplish. And so there's that kind of set me on. But I was involved with technology early on, have been involved with technology for a very long time. A lot of that speaking and some of those things that you mentioned at the beginning involved me. I was a leading expert on cybersecurity around email-borne viruses back when email was new and it was taking down companies like Ford Motor Company or Boeing and things like that. And I was one of the leading experts. And so people talked to me about that. When it came to hosted services and the internet and business, again, I was kind of out in front of that. And so I've had this opportunity of being out in front, but I've always worked for someone else. And I got to tell you, over the years, and I had this conversation yesterday with somebody, I have made other people tens and tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. And I don't say that figuratively. I went to a company, they brought me in, I invented this concept, thought about patenting it, but it was like, it can't be that cool. The young man that I worked for sold the company for $40 million around that concept. And that was the second company I had done that for. Went to another company, again, ideas. And so what happened was I found myself in a situation where I decided at a very late age, I want to do this for myself. And that's what happened. Now, so one of the things then, I was going along as a software executive of an international software company. They had brought me on when they were a startup. They didn't have a lot of money. So I came on in a consulting role, getting paid a commission based on sales as a marketing executive, which is unusual. I didn't get paid unless my overall efforts helped the company grow. Well, the company went from 1 million to 10 million, did very well, very well. But which means I started to make a lot of money. The founders weren't comfortable with that. And I got the founder call me up one day and saying, "You're making too much money. You're making more money than I am. We're going to change your compensation package." So they ratcheted me down and made it retroactive, excuse me. So I kind of had to pay money back because I wasn't happy with that. Then one day, and because I was still,
Shocker.
they had hired my company to be, they were a Canadian company, and they didn't want to have U.S. employees. So they had hired my company to be their executive vice president of marketing. So it was me, but it was me as a company, not as an individual, as an employee. I worked with my wife. They fired me. They fired me and gave my job to my wife.
Ooh,
okay.
What?
Yes.
So it's getting interesting.
You said, what
She must be incredible, though.
Ex-wife.
Okay.
It got spicy. And on top of that, about 30 days earlier, I'd gotten a phone call from a friend asking me if he was looking at this new gig, and would I be interested in joining him if he went to this new gig? I'm like, sure. Now, I wasn't actively looking for a job, but when somebody that you know and trust and respect calls you up and says, "Hey, I got something that might be of interest. Are you interested?" Keep your doors open. Keep the options open. I said, sure. They fired me. The next day, they make an announcement. Richard has left the company, which was a shock. I was the face of the entire industry that I was in. We were the largest vendor. I was the face of the I was all over the world. Then they make an announcement that the CEO is retiring and the new CEO is coming on board. And I'm listening, and I was listening in. So I won't say how I was listening in, but I was listening in on this company call. And I got a funny feeling. And all of a sudden, they announced the new CEO. Guess who the new CEO was? My buddy that had called me 30 days earlier, who hadn't told me what the gig was, but had tested to see if I was interested in leaving my current company and I would follow him. So when the founder called me up and fired me, he made an interesting statement that I didn't understand. "Well, you're looking for a job anyway." I'm like, "I'm not."
Wow.
Yeah, I am, because the new CEO had vetted me beforehand, my buddy, to see if I was willing to leave. Thereby, they fired me the day before he came on. He came on, made the CEO. They gave the job to my wife, now ex-wife. And I suddenly found myself in a very awkward situation.
Wow.
Because I'm the face of the industry. I had a lot of people asking, but I can't say anything because my only income is coming through, at the time, my wife. So I don't want to upset that apple cart. I can't really go to a vendor or a competitor, or what am I going to do? And it was that point I realized I had to reinvent myself completely. I had to pivot away from what I had been doing for over a decade and try to learn how to do something new. So I started a podcast. I wrote a book, self-published it, self-edited it, self-wrote it. Not a good idea. I'm going to tell you right now, that is not a good idea.
What not to do with Richard Bliss?
It is technically still on Amazon, but there are spelling errors on the back cover. I mean, that's how bad it was. It was called Stealing the Show. If you're a small,
you can revise a book, right?
Yeah, I know. I got to go fix that. I just haven't got around to it. But I did write a new book that is professionally done. Anyway, I started a podcast and I started learning about social media. And I stopped myself back then. This was in 2011. So we're talking 12 years ago. I LinkedIn was still kind of a job resume, job site, but I started researching and learning and sitting in on seminars and paid a little bit of money to people who taught me basic stuff that I kind of already knew. But it was interesting to see where the rest of the industry was. Because of those activities, I had a company reach out to me out of the blue that I had never heard of through a contact who said, look, we're going to do a bunch of writing on Forbes, and this company needs someone to come in who understands technology, the industry, who understands how to work with executives, who knows how to write, and you just wrote a book. They didn't read it, good thing. And lives in Silicon Valley, available immediately, and is willing to work for $800 a month. Okay? Are you interested? I said, absolutely. That ex-wife was not happy. She's like, what are you doing? I'm like, don't you understand what just happened? A door, as you said, Chris, earlier, a door got opened.
Yeah.
I have the chance to step in to a $6 billion company and sit down with their vice chairman and craft his voice online and on Forbes. And as part of my compensation, I get to write on Forbes under my own byline as well.
Ooh,
and they're going to pay
winner.
me $800 for one of his articles a month and as many of my articles as I wanted to write. Well, once I started doing it for him, then the general counsel wanted it, then the head of sales wanted it, then the head of marketing. And pretty soon they just brought me on as an employee with a 6-figure salary to come in and work with all of these executives. And then I had an interesting conversation because I got to tell you guys, I'm hustling. I'm just like trying to make it work, just and I finally went to somebody and said, I don't have a plan here. What advice would you have? And this woman said, get out of marketing, get into sales. And I'm like, I don't know anything about sales. She said, marketing's a cost center. Sales is a revenue center. The closer you're aligned with revenue, the more secure you'll be. I was like, okay. So I started working with this company's sales reps and started training the new sales reps on the things I knew about what it meant to be to build your profile online. And that became more and more common. Then the CEO of another company reached out to me and said, hey, would you come do for our company what you were doing for that company? And we'll give you a 40% increase in pay.
No.
Is this like a trick question? Went to work for them. That was a year. A year later, through some leadership changes and anything, I found myself again in transition. That vice chairman, that CEO, and several other people came to me and said, Richard, what you're doing is so incredibly valuable for sales teams and for executive individuals. You need to do it for yourself.
Bingo.
And that was a big, big leap because I'd never done that. Everybody else had always had that safety net for me. And now I'm stepping into it. Well, the good news is I had recently remarried. My wife had a brand new job, great job here in Silicon Valley. And she said, look, I've got the benefits. We're covering the expenses. Take the leap. And that's part of the luck that comes with it. It's one thing to leap with no safety net, but she was there to say, I support you. I'll carry you. Let's do this for a couple of years. Well, within a year, LinkedIn names me one of their top voices on their platform, number 8 in sales. I suddenly jumped to 118,000 followers on LinkedIn. I got 65,000 followers on my LinkedIn. And I got to tell you, gentlemen, so people say, how'd you do that? That was not a plan. It was a series of actions that I took unrelated that all came together at the perfect time, perfect storm that then placed me out in front, talking about subject matters that people really wanted to know about. Okay, Chris, the show's not that long, but that was a very long story to get to where I am today with what I'm doing and the impact I'm having.
That's amazing. A lot of what you talk about, there's this hustle narrative. A lot of things happened serendipitously, though, because you're taking action, as you said. I'm curious, after all that, how did you handle the adversity? Because that's a lot. I mean, dealing with wife, ex-wife, friends, changing jobs.
Yeah. So this is not written down anywhere. So don't share this with anybody. Are we recording? Oh, wait, we are.
Safe. Everybody put
When
that
that
to use.
divorce happened, I had $700,000 in debt when that divorce happened. And what was interesting, I told you I write goals. A friend of mine came over. I used to have board game night twice a month. 20 people would come to my house and we'd play board games. By the way, that podcast that I ran was about Kickstarter, teaching board gamers how to use Kickstarter to raise funds for their board games. Why? Because on Kickstarter, the number one funding category on Kickstarter is board games by far. There are 500 new board game Kickstarter projects every 30 days. And so I use that audience to test my LinkedIn skills, my Twitter skills, my podcasting skills, my speaking skills, because that was safe. If I screwed up there, nobody's going to notice or care. Well, when the divorce happened, right before the divorce, I had my friend come over. He's an attorney, high-powered attorney, senior partner at a very prestigious law firm. And he looked on my wall, and right by my monitor, I had a 3x5 card. And I could reach, and I have a pile of 3x5 cards, always within reach. And it said, debt-free by 53. That's all it said. And I had it pinned up there and had been sitting there. And he looked, he says, that's an admirable goal. And I looked at him and I said, I'm never going to reach it. Because he didn't know at the time that I had $700,000 of debt and it was growing. I'm not going to go into the details about why. You can probably guess about why. But at this point, it wasn't looking good. And yet, when I turned 53, just 18 months, 2 years later, I was debt free. Not because I did it, but because a series of circumstances. But I had created that goal, and I believe firmly that I put that out. I manifested that in the universe, and the universe aligned itself, quite shocking to me, to bring that into alignment. So that when I walked away a month after my 53rd birthday, I was debt free. That $700,000 of debt was gone.
That's incredible. When we talk about hustle, a lot of times, right? We talked about that. Hustle is really about not just working hard, but what are the behaviors that come from that, and that goal setting mentality. Right, to your point, so many people will say they have a goal, but how many really write it down? How many look at it on a regular basis? Can you share a little bit about just the process, kind of the behaviors that you follow relative to that goal setting? Because we talk a lot about goal setting and learning from your growth and things like that. And I think, that's a behavior of the super successful that we hear time and time again.
Several elements of that. One, this is a manifestation box. That's what my daughter calls it. I didn't call it that. I called it a goal box. I've had this for years. What's inside of it? A series of 3x5 cards with very simple things written on it. I write down an idea, a thought, a goal, and I just drop it into this box. And then I never look at it again. Nope. I wrote it down, I crystallized it, I identified what I wanted, and then I put it in this box and I shut it away. And then about every 3 to 5 years, I come back and go through the list of cards. And I see what happened. For example, about 15 years ago, I put inside this box that I wanted to write for a newspaper. It might have been 20 years ago because newspapers existed back then. I wanted to write for a newspaper. Why? It was just a random thing. And then 10 years ago, I get reached out and said, how would you like to write on Forbes? And I got to tell you, that's close enough.
That's okay.
Right? I'm okay. I'm going to call that one good. Another one I had was, there's too many stories here in the show that we have for me to cover all of these stories, but this has become such a fundamental element. I have 5 daughters. They follow this philosophy. I have been told many times that I'm one of the most goal-driven individuals that people have met. But I had a goal one day of, this had been happening too often, that this coincidence of just simply manifesting it, it came true, and it started getting crazy. So I decided one day, I'm going to get really crazy. I said to myself, 5 years from now, 4 years from now, I want to be sitting on an airplane, flying from Johannesburg, South Africa, to Malaysia to speak at a conference about email and email security. And I'm going to be sitting in seat 4A. All right. And it's going to be on I actually said it's going to be on my 40th birthday. That's what's going to be happening. And I shared it. I wrote it down. I have it written down in one of those many, many journals I have. And I started talking to people about it. This is my goal. How are you going to do that? No idea. 3 months later, lost my job. Okay. Different job. I tend to lose jobs a lot. This is starting to sound bad, but
it's part of being an entrepreneur, actually.
It really is. But I lost my job. Lost my job right after I wrote this goal. Boom, job's gone away. So then I was sharing it with one friend, and she said to me, "Who's sitting next to you?" Interesting question. So I closed my eyes. I went back into that vision, and I realized no one's sitting next to me. I'm sitting by myself. She wanted to know if I'm traveling with someone. She wanted more details. So the years go by and we're getting closer. And then what happened was my birthday happens to be in April. Okay. We're coming up on my birthday as we record this episode. In November, before my 40th birthday, I am on a tour throughout New Zealand, Australia, Malaysia, and Singapore, doing email conferences, traveling around. Now it's November, so I'm ahead of schedule by about 4 months, 6 months. But that's pretty darn close. And I ended up in Malaysia. And then on my 40th birthday, I'm on a plane flying west to east, New York to London. I'm sitting in seat 4A, and I'm on my way to speak at an email conference. Before the plane takes off, a gentleman boards the plane and sits down in 4B next to me. And I got to tell you, gentlemen, that of all of the things I manifested, that one irritated most. It's like, wait a minute. There's not supposed to be anybody in that seat.
Damn it.
I've been thinking I was all by myself the whole time.
Well, right before the door closes, the flight attendant comes up to that gentleman and says, "Sir, 3 rows back, we've got 2 empty seats, a row to itself. Would you like to have your own row to yourself?" He's like, "Yeah." Yes. He gets up, goes back there. 4B is empty from New York to London. I'm sitting by myself in 4B on my 40th birthday, on my way to speak at an email conference, having visited Malaysia to do the very same thing a few months earlier. And I thought to myself, that's good enough. I'm close enough. So the process, Dustin,
can I ask, how much do I have to pay for this manifestation box? Because this seems like magic to me. Because we
could market the shit out of these on Amazon.
Yeah, I don't know why you're selling your book on Amazon. Let's sell this box. This is
okay. Now I got one more story. Then I got lots more, but I'm going to share one more story.
Let's do it.
I am living in Utah, and I meet someone who I just knew. And I said, "What are you doing this summer?" They said, "I'm flying to Taiwan to teach English." I said, "I want to do that." I happened to have a passport at the time. I had been living in South America. And I said, "I want to do that. I have a passport." They said, "Well, it costs $2,000 to join this program. You pay them $2,000, they fly you over there." I'm like, "Okay." So I call up my mother. No. I call up my relatives. I call up my rich aunt, who I've never spoken to. No. I'm like, "Okay, fine. But I've written it down. Go to Taiwan. Teach English." I have no job. I have nothing. So then I'm just hanging out. And so a recruiter for the Army comes up and says, "Hey, we'll pay you $600 to go to Fort Knox, Kentucky for the summer. You don't have to join the Army. It's just a camp. You get to test it and kind of go through basic training. And then if you like it, maybe you get a scholarship and you join the Army." I'm like, I have nothing to do. Sure, I'll do that. So I get on a plane and I go to Fort Knox, Kentucky from Utah. And I go through this. My girlfriend breaks up with me while I'm there, which was a bummer. And I get done with it. I had a great time. And that's interesting to say because I was significantly older than almost all of the other people there who were at like 19, 18. I was in my early 20s, having spoken. I'd lived in a foreign country, that type of thing. So they decide to fly you home anywhere you want to go. Well, I didn't want to go back to Utah. I'm from Seattle. I'm like, "Fly me to Seattle." So the Army's like, "Okay." So they give me a one-way ticket to Seattle. I arrive in Seattle. It's Sunday morning. I happen to be at church, and I run into somebody in the hallway who I haven't seen in years from high school. said, hey, what are you doing? He says, oh, I'm just back from Taiwan. Really? He says, yeah, I have a little business over there teaching English. Really? I want to go. And he looks at me because we're literally just standing like right outside the church and we just ran into each other. I want to go. He's like, you're serious? I'm like, yeah. He says, okay, I can get you a ticket for $660 round trip from Seattle to Taiwan because of connections he had with the Chinese consulate. I'm like, okay, I have $600. The Army just paid me. They paid me $100 a week. I have $600. I'm like, okay, I need $60. So I call up the girlfriend who just dumped me. Could I borrow $60? She's like, she's feeling bad for me. Sure. So she loans me $60. I give it to this guy. He goes and buys me a round trip ticket to Taiwan. But the problem here is, gentlemen, is that it's the weekend. It's Saturday. We're flying out in 10 days. I have no money. And all of my stuff is still in Utah. So how am I going to get my stuff? So the next day, I'm talking to a group of individuals and I mentioned this dilemma. The guy sitting next to me looks at me and he says, I have this truck that has a trailer that needs to be delivered to Provo, Utah. If I paid your gas, would you drive it to Provo, Utah? I'm like, sure. When do you want me to leave? Monday? This was Sunday. I'm like, sure. Next day I get up, climb into this truck. He gives me some money for gas. Off I go. Seattle to Utah is a long drive. Done it many times. Several hours in, I see a hitchhiker. I pick him up. I tell him my story. He's like, well, I'm going to Boise. If you take me to Boise, my girlfriend has a spare bedroom and we'll let you stay in her spare bedroom because it's halfway. I'm like, sure. So we get to Boise, middle of the night. I stay in the spare bedroom. I get up the next morning. I don't even see them. I take a shower, get on my truck, and I drive to Provo. And I drop off the truck and trailer. Now it's like Tuesday, Wednesday, something like that. Monday, Tuesday, something. Then I get all my stuff. Now I've got a dilemma. How do I get from Utah back to Seattle in time to make this flight on the following Tuesday? As I'm walking down the street in Provo, Utah, I encounter the parents of my best friend from high school, where I went to school in the Seattle area. I'm like, what are you guys doing here? They said, well, our oldest son just graduated from the university and we can't figure out how to get his pickup from Provo, Utah back to Seattle. And so we're trying to figure that out. I said, if you pay me gas money, I'll drive it. And they're like, deal. Keys, money. The next day I get in the truck, drive. There's other stories involved with it, but I get back to Seattle. I stay at their house to drop off the truck. I don't have anywhere to stay. I stay at their house. On the way, now I'm ready to go to the airport. On the way to the airport, I still have no money. My buddy who's driving me is a pizza delivery guy, and his ashtray is full of quarters. So I take a handful of quarters, which happen to be $10, get on the plane. On my way to Taiwan, I have $10 in quarters. I didn't know they don't exchange coin, right? You can't exchange coin with foreign currency. You can't take quarters and get yen or sucre or whatever. But the guy sitting next to me heard my story, took pity on me. No. First of all, the flight attendant took pity on me. She allowed me to exchange my quarters for cash because back then when they did the headsets, I spent $2 of those to listen to the headset. The guy sitting next to me taught me my first words of Chinese, ni hao ma, gave me $2. So I had $10 so I could exchange the $10 for currency. We land in Narita, Tokyo on our way to Taiwan. There's a typhoon. We're all delayed. My buddy, we meet a couple of girls. They're on their way to Taiwan. They've got money. They don't speak Chinese. My buddy speaks Chinese. We don't have any money. We end up in Taiwan for the evening with their money. We all get a hotel room together, sleeping on the floor. I got to tell you, they were panicked. We're a couple of honest, innocent guys, but they were a little freaked out. Next morning, they give us some money. We get on a train and boom, I spent a year in Taiwan based on a manifestation that I wanted to go. That's another long story. We're going to run out of time, but Dustin,
great.
to answer what at the time, now that is crazy. That is absolutely crazy story. But the point was, I so firmly believed in this concept of, look, if you just put it out there, the universe is going to line up and give it to you. And here I find myself today in a position where I kind of envisioned it and wrote some of this down years ago, and then made the decisions in my life to find my way here. And sometimes those decisions were made subconsciously, but I helped the universe and my own mind identify what is it that I want. And then it arranged the ways for me to go get it.
So manifestation happens, but you still have to take action, right?
You have to take that step. I can remember standing in front of the mirror because remember that Army thing I did? They offered me a scholarship to the university. And I had to take it immediately. So I stood in front of the mirror with my hands out like a scales of justice and said to myself, what are the pros and cons? Because I'm about to make a decision in my life that's going to change my life forever. Do I bypass the opportunity of going to Taiwan and lose the scholarship? Or do I take the scholarship and lose the opportunity of going to Taiwan? And the decision was, I can go to school and I can figure out a way to pay for school, but I'll never find a way on my own to figure out how to get to Taiwan. So the experience, I made the decision based on what I felt was a positive experience for me. Hence, kind of like taking that $800 job to step into a tech role where I can't figure out how this is going to pay my bills, but I can see that it's a decision that's going to make ripples in my life. And having the courage to take that decision and make that step, even though you're blinded by the how or the what, but you're really motivated by the faith to take that step. You know, it reminds me of the whole Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. When he tosses, right, he's got to take that invisible step out onto that chasm and he doesn't know how he's going to do it. And then he doesn't see the bridge that's there. And so that's kind of how it is that there's a bridge there. You're going to fail. I have failed on numerous times. 2X marriages is kind of two of those failures. But
well, when we talk about hustle, the T in hustle is about taking chances. And so often, if you're not taking chances, if you're so averse to risk, you're never going to really get far, right? Like if you compare it to athletics, if nobody dives for a ball, that's a risk, right? I mean, you might just get a bruised knee and not do anything, right? But your ability to and willingness to take chances in each of those turns of the story, and willingness to fail if that happens, and learn from it and move forward, right? That fail forward mentality is so critical. And when it's such an interesting thing. I don't know. I can guarantee you, I've never heard a story like that for sure.
But you bring up basketball, right?
The commonality is,
Go ahead. The commonality.
Well, but yeah, I mean, but the commonality between what you're talking about and others is, you made a decision that this is kind of what I want. You were willing to take action, even if you didn't know all of the steps to get there, and willingness to take risks to get closer to that. I mean, you could have ended up throughout that whole story, you could have ended up anywhere around the country and not made it to your goal and still missed the plane. But yet, because you were willing to continue to take action that you believed was going to lead to that next step, you ended up getting to, where you had a dream to begin with.
So many people restrict their ability to achieve things because they can't see the how. How am I going to do that? Why would I even set that goal? How can I achieve that goal? Why would I even do that? And that is the limitation of that's limiting the universe because of your lack of imagination. You don't need to know the how. Just know the what. What is it you want? Well, I want a 6-figure job working for a software company. Okay. Now, as long as you don't get too specific, although my examples were really specific, as long as you're willing to say, okay, was I disappointed that I wasn't on a flight from Johannesburg to Malaysia on my birthday, but I had done it 3 months earlier or 6 months earlier? No, good enough. Let's also help the universe recognize that sometimes it knows it'll get us close enough, and we need to realize that target's pretty big. It can't be too narrow, right? Although my debt-free by 53, that was a pretty narrow target.
I think seat 4C is pretty specific.
Yes, that's true.
747.
Yeah, that's true. That one was pretty crazy.
That's Richard, so you talk about this manifestation, and you've got some amazing stories as we've heard. Where in your consulting do you talk about that? Is that a part of what you do when you're talking to businesses?
Yeah. So in my business, I work with, let's call them high profile individuals. I work with high profile individuals. So usually executives at tech companies, some generally not politicians. I've got a few friends that I've worked with that you might know some names of. Roger Craig and Ronnie Lott might be two names that you might recognize from the NFL, who I've done some work with over the years. If you go, they've got some Forbes content out there that I assisted in making that happen. I work with a lot of executives. When it comes to that, oftentimes I say that there are three myths when it comes to social media, particularly for executives, for leaders. I don't have the time. Everything's self-promotional, and I have nothing to say anyway. That's interesting. And so
that's bullshit is what it is.
Right? But those myths are true enough to prevent action from being taken. They don't want to be that pop star politician idiot who's doing stupid stuff on social media. They don't want to be that. It's all self-promotional. And then when they look at their own life, they're like, I really don't have that much to say that anybody would be interested in. One of the things I've been able to do is pull those stories out of these individuals, stories that are incredible, amazing, stories that just make you just say, how is that possible? Why? Well, you guys have already got a taste of it because I have lived my life with amazing stories. And people don't always ask me about them. And sometimes I have to be careful to shut my mouth because as long as Buzz Aldrin is not in the room, I usually have a story that can top pretty much anybody's saying. But if it's Buzz Aldrin, I walked on the moon. It's like, okay, boom, we're done. Right. And so helping them understand that these stories resonate with their audience, inspire, create a human connection. That's what I'm able to do is when I work with these individuals is pull those stories out. And oftentimes it's, where do you want to go? What do you see? Why do you want to be on LinkedIn? That's often one of the number one questions. I had one yesterday or this week say, I want leads. I'm like, well, that is not wrong. That is not going to work. He's like, I'm really glad we're friends because normally I pay a client a lot of money to tell me that. I said, yeah, I'm glad we're friends too, because don't pay me a lot of money because that's not going to happen.
You will fail.
But that is the point, is helping them understand that they have stories to tell that are relevant. And that those stories can have a huge influence on their prospects, their customers, their partners, and their employees. And it is sometimes surprising to them when somebody will say, nobody's interested in that. I'm like, oh yeah, they are. People are really interested in that.
Richard, so I'm a digital marketing guy. I love social media. And I wrote an article once and I got a lot of response to it. And I said that, the best way to sell online is to sell by indirectly selling. And one of the components of that is storytelling. Add so much value to your newsfeed that you become interesting. And you have to find what is that story. And sometimes you do. You got to dig deep in, figure out what that is. But ultimately, storytelling, focusing on adding value, thought leadership, that is where people will want to connect with you. And I was telling someone the other day that, ultimately, if you do a good enough job of that, you will not have to cold message and spam the hell out of people on LinkedIn. They will come to you as a byproduct.
Yeah, you're the one that's getting the receiving end of all of that interest. And you make a good point. I tell them, look, if you become interesting, your company becomes interesting. If you want business, become an interesting person, and that will cause people to be interested in the company that you work for or represent or the cause or whatever. And that's exactly what you're saying, Chris. How do we become interesting? Storytelling. Right? Dustin, as you just said, you've never heard those stories before, right? And I've got more. I've got more, but I'm not even going to go there because enough that I oftentimes will just let other people tell their story so that they can be interesting. I don't need to one-up them, but I can appreciate what they've done and see where they're going because they're on a different stage of their life journey than I am. And I can recognize it. And so one of the things I encourage people to do is take those risks so that you have those stories to tell. My daughter works for me, Leah, my oldest, and she says, because people are like, how do you have so many stories? Well, one, her dad, but two, people who have interesting stories to tell, pay attention to the stories that are happening around them. Right now, I am sitting in a tent in my backyard. Okay. The amount of people who find that absolutely fascinating, But some people would just look at that as like, well, I got stuck out here because of this and this and this, and it's not really interesting to people. Yes, it is. And take that opportunity to tell that part of your story of where you found it, how that happened. And so there's all kinds of different ways to tell stories around us from some of the most mundane. But oftentimes we can't see it from the other person's perspective. So all we see is the mundane. Oh, that's just a mundane thing, but nobody's really going to be interested in that. I had one executive. I was walking with him and I said, where are you going? He says, I need to go by my booth. Why? I need to go check the padding of the carpet. Okay. I don't know if any of you guys have worked any kind of trade show booth.
Oh yeah.
Right? It's brutal. It's carpeting on cement. It's brutal. I said, why? He said, I spent years as a salesperson working booths and my back was killing me from standing on that. And I swore that if I ever got into a position to make a difference and have the decision-making power, I would get the thickest carpet for my sales teams to stand on because they were having to stand there. And I wanted to make sure that my orders got followed through with. I looked at him and said, that is an incredibly powerful story. He looked at me like I was crazy. What are you talking about? No. And sure enough, I helped him craft that. And let's put that out on LinkedIn. And he was shocked at the hundreds of thousands of people who responded to that story because you guys, we all, our backs start hurting and our feet start, because we've been there.
Absolutely.
Sometimes understanding how the story resonates with another audience is the greatest way of telling those stories, is finding ways to tell stories. Now, maybe you didn't travel halfway around the world because there's other parts of that story that get even crazier, but I won't go into that. But maybe your story involves your neighbor, or it involves your children, or it involves your pet, or it involves your job, or it involves something. There's always going to be an interesting story to tell, and now just be comfortable telling them.
You know, it's interesting.
Right. That's incredible.
On most platforms, there is a component baked into the algorithm, Facebook specifically, that they promote life-changing content. So pregnancies, births, marriages, deaths, they live at the top of the newsfeed for a much longer period of time. And when I talk to my clients, I encourage them to find that celebratory narrative. And in some cases, it's not as much celebratory as it is storytelling with a positive ending. And you can't do that with everything, obviously, but it is incredible. Sometimes you take the most amount of time polishing a piece of content. You're like, oh my gosh, nobody liked this. And then the random thing you throw out there, you're like, what? Where people find this interesting?
Right. And those algorithms are different. And Chris, you've seen my writing and Richard Vanderblom's writing. The algorithms on LinkedIn are fundamentally different because they're driven by a different business model. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, they're all driven by the advertising model. More eyeballs, more money. LinkedIn is not driven by that model. They make 80% of their revenue from paying customers. People who are paying for LinkedIn Premium, people who are paying for LinkedIn Sales Navigator, people who are paying for LinkedIn Recruiter, which means that they're crafting an experience radically different. And that means they're looking for a radically different interaction and outcome. They are not looking to entertain. If you put a cat on Roomba and throw up on LinkedIn, LinkedIn's not going to show it to anybody. But it's going to crush it on Instagram, TikTok, right? That cat going around. LinkedIn's like, nope. And this is why people are shocked by the tactics they use on the other social media platforms. When they come to LinkedIn, they don't work because LinkedIn's looking for a very different outcome from your content. They're not trying to show it to a lot of people to drive advertising revenue. They're trying to show it to as few people as possible and then watch how those people interact with your content to then determine, is it valuable to be shared on their platform? Your own audience is determining whether your content is seen by a wider audience. And it comes through conversations. Did you start a conversation with your content? Did it start people commenting? Thereby, we recognize that we should share it with more people because they only share your content with 10% of your connections. It's not to everybody. It's only a small fraction because they're not looking for the maximum eyeballs on the content. They're looking for the maximum conversation.
That's what makes it a great platform. I love that.
It is. Sure. It is.
Yeah. Richard, I got one last question before we wrap it up. And one of the things we like to talk about a lot is leadership. You work with a lot of businesses, a lot of leaders. What are a couple of trends you're finding right now in leadership?
one, I continue to be shocked at the hesitancy for leaders to be active on the social media sphere, to be participating in the conversations. It's still a struggle for them. Now it's shifting, and it's interesting why it's shifting. It's shifting because they're aging out. I've been doing this for a long time. The leaders I was working with before were almost traditionally all boomers. And they didn't have the built-in understanding fundamentally of how social media works. Now, that is not all of them. One of my best clients, partner's friend, Tom Mendoza, who, if you've gone to University of Notre Dame, the school is named after him. He's the exception and outlier, that he understood and grasped the concept immediately and asked for my help to make that happen. But most leaders that I have worked with in the past, because of their age and experience, they just, I mean, when they say that they've been doing this since the late 1900s, that's not impressive to anybody. It's impressive to them. Hey, I've been doing this for 30 years. Great. Floppy disks and covered wagons. You've been doing this for a long time. But to this new generation, that doesn't hold any kind of significance to them. Quite the opposite. So leaders today, as they age out, some of them are looking to make that transition. Okay, now I'm retiring, but I still want to be active on boards or philanthropy or whatever. All right, let me help you understand how to build a presence online doing that. Other leaders are coming in and saying, well, my job is just to run the company. No, your job is to lead and lead people who run the company. So helping them understand the importance of participating in the conversations that are happening online has gotten easier because of, and I'm not making a political statement here, but because of Trump, it got easier for them to recognize the power of social media as a leader, that their voice could carry far beyond the walls or reach of the geography. And so that helped me point to them and say, look, as long as you do it right, you can wield tremendous influence. And so what they're struggling with is, of the three myths, time, but I have nothing important to say. And so this is where they have been hidden behind a marketing PR engine, corporate lawyers or whoever. And now when I tell them that they have to have an authentic voice, they don't know what that sounds like.
Yeah,
because
they may not even know what that means.
They've never had. It comes back to what Dustin was saying. They don't know what hustle means, right? They're, when you got youth basketball and you tell the kid to hustle. I got an 8-year-old grandson. He's a basketball star. He's doing a great job. I'm very proud of him. But you tell them to hustle, and what do? They just start running around waving their arms. And so when you tell an executive to use their authentic voice, it is almost impossible because they have no track record, experience, background, or even a model to follow that says, what does it sound and feel like when I use my authentic voice? And that is some of the biggest challenges, hence my book, Digital First Leadership, getting leaders to rethink how they approach their leadership role. It used to be your digital presence followed your physical presence. That has now flipped. You physically follow your digital identity. People will look you up on LinkedIn before they meet you. People will look you up on LinkedIn before you show up to a speech. You've been named a new CEO. Where did they go? They're going to Google you? No. They're going to go look you up on LinkedIn. Your digital identity now is leading in every aspect of the business world, and your physical presence is following. In my book, I use an example of how important this is. During the presidential election, Michael Bloomberg flooded the airways with ads and digital presence, and it was working. People were paying attention. He was rising through the rolls. Now, he was spending a bucket load of money. And then what happened? He stepped out on stage, and the physical person failed to match the digital person, right? We saw someone who was a bit arrogant, out of touch, bored. What am I doing here? Kind of unprepared. You're like, did
kind
no
of
one
relatable, actually.
Very unrelatable. But that was not his digital identity. On his digital identity, he was present. You got all this confidence. My point to that, using that example, is, look, your digital identity is how it's being formed. You better make sure your physical identity, the real person, follows what you're creating online in order for you to be effective. Because if they meet the real person and it's different, not only is there a disconnect, but you lose all credibility. Michael Bloomberg disappeared overnight when the what were they doing? On stage, what's that called?
Yeah.
The debates.
Yeah.
I could not remember the word.
Yeah.
He lost all credibility and disappeared off the stage. So that's a perfect example. So hopefully I've answered your question, Chris, on about that.
You did. That was awesome. I have to ask one more question because I forgot this was on my list. Is you talk a lot about social selling. Can you talk about that? Because I think that's just so important in today's world.
It means so many different things, and it's kind of a catchphrase. And I had somebody this week tell me, we're not people aren't searching for social selling. And so it's a term that's used to describe a behavior without it necessarily being easily defined. So when I talk about digital world, outside of the physical is still important. You always want to lead it towards that phone call, that in-person meeting, if you're a salesperson. But social selling is the idea of understanding how to build relationships with your prospects and customers that are genuine, but are done through a social interaction online. Social media, not social like I went to a social and we all sat around and had drinks and talked about golf. Because of Chris, I know you like to talk about golf. So that would, I usually talk about board games, although we have not talked about board games at all on this podcast. And so that is what social selling to me is about. Using it, but that's why LinkedIn is so effective. You can't really fake you can, but it's hard to fake your presence on LinkedIn. Your work history is there, your engagement's there. Every time you comment on something that's being pushed to your network, everything you like is being pushed to your network. Your identity on LinkedIn is as close to legit as any of the other social media platforms. That means when it comes to social selling, using your digital identity on LinkedIn to engage with prospects and customers is a perfect substitute for when you can't do it in person. That is the concept for me of social selling.
I think that's important both in leadership, in marketing, in business, in sales. So I'm glad you could touch on that.
Richard, tell our audience where they can find you.
You can find me on LinkedIn, Richard Bliss. There might be a lot of Richard Blisses on LinkedIn, but I just registered a new domain name yesterday, therichardbliss.com. Why don't I have richardbliss.com? Because during my first divorce, I lost it, which is another story. So LinkedIn, Twitter, you can find me. I'm not as active there. I tend to be, but Richard Bliss on Twitter, Richard Bliss on Facebook. And then they can just find me on LinkedIn. So that would be the ways to find me. And then the book, and then my podcast, you can find that off the website. And then here's something that's interesting. If people want to follow me and have a series of tech tips, LinkedIn tips, I provide a service where you can send me a text message. And if you want, I can give you the number. But if they send me a text message to that number and just put in the word #LinkedIn, I will send a weekly LinkedIn tech tip. Did that come out right? Yeah. A weekly tip to your phone. I'll just send you a text message. I won't abuse it or anything. Don't sell it to anybody, but that's a one way to kind of see that, So I don't know. I can say it, or if you want, we can throw it into how do you want me to here's the number: 415-534-9722. 415-534-9722. If your audience sends me a text message with #LinkedIn to that number, they'll get a little welcome message from me. And then every week I send out a LinkedIn tip that just reminding, mostly this is for salespeople. We call that flattening the forgetting curve, because they go through my training and I'm trying to just keep them reminded, like, hey, don't forget about this. Don't forget about that. So there's so much to cover. None of it, which you covered in this podcast, which surprised me. We talked about things I haven't talked about for quite a while. So this was fun.
Great.
This was fun. Richard, thank you. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Hustle Nation podcast. Until next time, peace.
Thank you for being part of the Hustle Nation. Until next time, stay hungry and inspire those around you to hustle.